All right, here's the latest analysis on the Israeli-Hamas war that Stratford has given. It states that we have long argued that the Arab-Israeli conflict is inherently insolvable. Now, for the third time in recent years, a war is being fought in Gaza. The Palestinians are firing rockets into Israel with minimal effect. The Israelis are carrying out a broader operation to seal tunnels along the Gaza-Israeli boundary. Like the previous wars, the current one will settle nothing. The Israelis want to destroy Hamas's rockets. They can do so only if they occupy Gaza and remain there for an extended period while engineers search for tunnels and bunkers throughout the territory. This would generate Israeli casualties from Hamas guerrillas fighting on their own turf with no room for retreat. So Hamas will continue to launch rockets, but between the extreme inaccuracy of the rockets and Israel's Iron Dome defense system, the group will inflict little damage to the Israelis. The most interesting aspect of this war is that both sides apparently found it necessary, despite knowing it would have no definitive military outcome. The kidnapping and the killing of 3 Israeli teenagers, followed by the incineration of a Palestinian boy, triggered this conflict. An argument of infinite regression always rages as to the original sin. Who committed the first crime? For Hamas, at least, and I suspect for many Palestinians in the West Bank, the only solution is Israel's elimination. For many Israelis, the only solution is to continue to occupy all captured territories until the Palestinians commit to peace and recognition. Since the same Israelis do not believe that day will ever come, the occupation would become permanent. Under these circumstances, the Gaza war is, in some sense, a matter of housekeeping. For Hamas, the point of the operation is demonstrating it can fire rockets at Israel. These rockets are inaccurate, but the important thing is that they were smuggled into Gaza at all, since this suggests more dangerous weapons eventually will be smuggled into the Palestinian territory. At the same time, Hamas is demonstrating that it remains able to incur casualties while continuing to fight. For the Israelis, the point of the operation is that they are willing to carry it out at all. The Israelis undoubtedly intend to punish Gaza, but they do not believe they can impose their will on Gaza and compel the Palestinians to reach a political accommodation with Israel. War's purpose is to impose your political will on your enemy. But unless the Israelis surprise us immensely, nothing decisive will come out of this conflict. Even if Israel somehow destroyed Hamas, another organization would emerge to fill its space in the Palestinian ecosystem. Israel can't go far enough to break the Palestinian will to resist. It is dependent on a major third-party state to help meet Israeli security needs. This creates an inherent contradiction whereby Israel receives enough American support to guarantee its existence, but because of humanitarian concerns, is not allowed to take the kind of decisive action that might solve its security problems. So here's just another example of Israel being held back by a greater international body, mainly the United States. So until something changes, Israel will always only be able to go so far until until the United States finally tells them to pull back or to lighten up. And as I've said many times, if the tables were changed and Canada or Mexico or Cuba were at some point firing rockets into the United States would use all their might to destroy any one of those countries. There would be no calls for restraint or any type of message of that nature. We're going on with the article. It says, we thus see periodic violence of various types, none of which will be intended or expected to achieve any significant political outcome. Wars here have become a series of blood-stained gestures. There are some limited ends to achieve, such as closing Palestinian tunnels and demonstrating Palestinian capabilities that force Israel into an expensive defensive posture, but Hamas will not be defeated, and Israel will make no concessions. So the question, therefore, is not what the point of all this is, although that is a fascinating subject, but where all this ends. All things human end. Previous long-standing conflicts, such as those between France and England, ended or at least changed shape. Israel and Palestine accordingly will resolve their conflict in due course. Now, of course, we believe, or many of us do anyway, that Ezekiel 38 and 39, when that takes place, the Gog and Magog war, that will end this conflict. Of course, there are some who believe that this latest Hamas war will mushroom into a much greater Psalm 83 war. But that's simply not going to happen. Unfortunately, many of Israel's neighbors are for Israel destroying Hamas. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others have basically blamed Hamas for starting this war and for the problems that they have. So I wouldn't expect this to balloon into anything other than just a major conflict. But it will be interesting to see where it all ends, and if it just comes right back down to another ceasefire that will take on a life of its own for the next 2 years or so. But going on with the article, it says many believe the creation of a Palestinian state will be the solution, and those who believe this often have trouble understanding why this self-evidently sensible solution has not been implemented. The reason is the proposed solution is not nearly as sensible as it might appear so. Issues of viability and sovereignty surround any discussion of a Palestinian state. Geography raises questions about the viability of any Palestinian Palestine has two population centers, Gaza and the West Bank, which are detached from one another. One population center, Gaza, is an enormously crowded, narrow stretch of land. Its ability to develop a sustainable economy is limited. The West Bank has more possibilities, but even it would be subordinate to a dynamic Israel. If the Palestinian workforce is drawn into the Israeli economy, both territories will become dependent upon Israel. Within its current borders, a viable Palestine is impossible to imagine. From the Israeli point of view, creating a Palestinian or Palestine along something resembling the 1967 lines leaves aside the question of Jerusalem, would give the Palestinians superb targets, namely Tel Aviv and Haifa. Given its history, Israel is unlikely to take that risk unless it had the right to oversee security in the West Bank in some way. That in turn would undermine Palestinian sovereignty. Frankly, I see an international force eventually coming in there and guaranteeing Israel's security, such as the United States or an international force, not necessarily the UN. As you play out the possibilities in any two-state solution, you run into the problem that any solution one side demanded would be unbearable to the other. Geography simply won't permit two sovereign states. In this sense, the extremists on both sides are more realistic than the moderates, but that reality encounters other problems. Currently, Israel is as secure as it will ever likely to be unless Hamas disappears, never to be replaced, and the West Bank becomes even more accommodating to Israel. Neither of these prospects is likely. Israel's economy towers over its neighbors. The Palestinians are weak and divided. None of Israel's neighbors pose any threat of invasion. A situation in place since the 1977 neutralization of Egypt. Jordan is locked into a close relationship with Israel. Egypt has its peace treaty, and Hezbollah is bogged down in Syria. Apart from Gaza, which is a relatively minor threat, Israel's position is difficult to improve. And what they're saying basically is that there's basically no threat to Israel from their neighbors right now. Don't expect some Psalm 83 war. And this is coming from one of the greatest intelligence sources that the world knows. And this is something I've been saying for some time now, that the facts on the ground simply don't support a Psalm 83 war at this time. Now, at some point in time, maybe during the tribulation period or toward the end of the tribulation period, you might see that happen because the Bible does suggest that Israel's neighbors will come down upon them. And something else that they brought up, that it says that Israel's in a pretty good position even with the onslaught of a Gaza war. But here are some things that could change dramatically, and if all these things began to come together at the same time, this is when you might see some type of a Psalm 83 war. And it says Israel can't radically shift its demography. It said, but several evolutions in the region could move against Israel. Now here's what they're saying. Egypt could change governments, renounce its treaty, rearm, and re-enter the Sinai Peninsula. Hezbollah could use its experience in Sinai to open a front in Lebanon. Syria could get an Islamic State-led government and threaten the Golan Heights. Islamists could overthrow Jordan's Hashemite monarchy and pose a threat to the east. Turkey could evolve into a radical Islamic government and send forces to challenge Israel. A cultural revolution could take place in the Arab world that would challenge Israel's economic superiority and therefore its ability to wage war. Iran could smuggle missiles into Gaza, and so on. There is accordingly an asymmetry of possibilities. It is difficult to imagine any evolution, technical, political, or economic, that would materially improve Israel's already dominant position, but there are many things that could weaken Israel, some substantially. Each may appear far-fetched at the moment, but everything in the future seems far-fetched. None is inconceivable. So it's not out of the question that there could be a chain reaction of events that could bring about a Psalm 83 war scenario. And again, this coming from one of the greatest intelligence reports the world knows. But many of the pieces would have to come into place all at the same time. And although it's not inconceivable, it's somewhat far-fetched at this point in time. It is a rule of politics and business to bargain from strength. Israel is now as strong as it is going to be. But Israel does not think that it can reach an accommodation with the Palestinians and would guarantee Israeli national security, a view based on a realistic reading of geography. Therefore, Israel sees little purpose in making concessions to the Palestinians, despite its relative position of strength. And although this seems to be an impossible situation, at some point in time the Bible does say there will be peace. Although a limited peace, there will be peace that the Antichrist will bring. And I've said this many times, that once the rapture of the church takes place and the Antichrist is revealed, this peace will be something that nobody in the world would expect. And certainly Satan is the most powerful being that this world will see until the Lord comes back and rules for 1,000 years. But he is much stronger than any and much smarter than any world leader we have right now. So even though we don't realize and can't conceive how this peace will come about, it will be nothing to him to bring peace. But getting back to the article, it says, in these circumstances, Israeli strategy is to maintain its power at a maximum level and use that influence it has to prevent the emergence of new threats. From this perspective, the Israeli strategy of settlements makes sense. So even though many in the world are just up in arms over the settlements, they all realize that it makes the most sense, but saying that out loud would not be very politically correct. If there will be no talks, and Israel must maintain its overwhelming advantage, creating strategic depth in the West Bank is sensible. It would be less sensible if there were a possibility of a peace treaty. Israel must also inflict a temporary defeat on any actively hostile Palestinian force from time to set them back several years and to demonstrate Israeli capabilities for psychological purposes. Now here's the Palestinian position. It says the Palestinian position, meanwhile, must be to maintain its political cohesion and wait, using its position to try to drive wedges between Israel and its foreign patrons, particularly the United States, but understanding that the only change in the status quo will come from changes outside the Israeli-Palestinian complex. The primary Palestinian problem will be to maintain itself as a distinct entity with sufficient power to resist an Israeli assault for some time. Any peace treaty would weaken the Palestinians by pulling them into the Israeli orbit and split them up. By refusing a peace treaty, they remain distinct if divided. That guarantees they will be there when circumstances change. So as I've said many times, the Palestinians really don't want a peace accord with Israel. In fact, that's the last thing they want. They're making way too much money, number one, and getting fat and rich too quick. And frankly, that would all end if this conflict ended. I mean, the last thing Hamas wants is for Israel to become a peace partner with them, because that, again, as I reported a few weeks ago, that Hamas is getting too rich, or at least the leadership is, due to the continuance of a conflict. Now the article goes on to say that time is not on Israel's side. They believe that at some point in time if this goes on for another 50 years, that Israel's opponents are going to be stronger. And this is what it says: time is not on Israel's side. At some point, something will likely happen to weaken its position, while it is unlikely that anything will happen to strengthen its position. That normally would be an argument for entering negotiations, but the Palestinians will not negotiate a deal that would leave them weak and divided, and any deal that Israel could live with would do just that. What we are seeing in Gaza is merely housekeeping, that is, each side trying to maintain its position. The Palestinians need to maintain solidarity for the long haul. The Israelis need to hold their strategic superiority as long as they can. But nothing lasts forever, and over time the relative strength of Israel will decline. Meanwhile, the relative strength of the Palestinians may increase, though this isn't certain. Looking at the relative risks, making a high-risk deal with the Palestinians would seem prudent in the long run, but nations do not make decisions on such abstract calculations. Israel will bet on its ability to stay strong. From a political standpoint, it has no choice. The Palestinians will bet on the long game. They have no choice. And in the meantime, blood will periodically flow. So there you have it. That is what Stratford sees for the long run of this Israeli-Hamas conflict. Now, certainly they're not taking into consideration what the Bible has to say. Their analysis is based upon meticulous intelligence fact-finding and from their many sources around the world. But we know that at some point in time when the rapture does take place, this world's going to change dramatically. And that's really what you should be keen upon, and that is that life will probably likely go on as this analysis does explain. But when the rapture takes place and the Holy Spirit is removed, meaning Christians will be taken out of this world, that this world will get evil in a hurry. And what was predictable in the past will no longer be predictable. And the advent of a satanically motivated leader, the likes of which the world has never seen or heard of before, will enter the world stage, and things will dramatically change forever. And even though you might be saying, "Oh man, I mean, if the Psalm 83 war is not around the corner, wow, we've still got a long time before the rapture of church takes place." Well, the Psalm 83 war or the rapture is not dependent upon some type of war that will bring about the rapture of the church. Unfortunately, that has become a problem here in the prophetic world. Everybody's looking for a war to trigger the rapture. But the rapture's always been something that was meant to motivate Christians to live holy throughout the church age, which means that the rapture could have taken place at any point during the church age. So with the threat of the Lord coming back at any moment, at any time during the church age, this has been something that God has used to motivate Christians to live holy lives. Because you certainly did not want to be caught living an unrighteous life when the rapture of the church takes place. So the rapture of the church is not dependent upon a circumstance or a war or whatever the case may be. But when the rapture does take place, look for all hell to break loose in time, the likes of which the world's never seen before. And if you really believe that the rapture of the church is about to take place or is around the corner, you need to get a copy of my Tribulation Period Survival Guide. Up in the right hand or left hand corner of this screen, you can now click on the message above, and it will take you to a place where you can get my free Tribulation Period Survival Guide. I've also created a copy that is in book form that is much easier to read and that you can hand to a lost loved one or friend or relative. That is something that you would have to purchase, though. I believe it's somewhere around the $8 mark. But it's a lot cheaper than going down to a print shop and having the free version printed out, which would cost you somewhere in the $12 to $13 range. That's the reason why I created this particular book, so that you could physically hand your lost loved one or relative this book. When the rapture does take place, they would have a Tribulation Period Survival Guide that would tell them that they need to be saved, and today is the day of salvation, and also give them tips on how to survive this horrible time period. So I would encourage you to give this, or buy multiple books if you can, or download multiple copies, go down to the print shop and print them out and hand them out to your lost loved ones and friends and neighbors. And as always, today is the day of salvation. If you have not come to the Lord, today is that time. Don't put it off. 150,000 people die every single day. The vast majority of them will end up, according to the Bible, in a burning hell. Don't let that happen to you. Well, this is Terry Malone with the Calvary Prophecy Report.